super excited to talk to you today about Analog, the Vite-powered Angular meta framework. So before I get started, a couple things about me. I'm a full-stack developer. I'm from Germany. I work with Angular and Java, and then I'm part of the Analog team, and I created something called the Spartan project, which tries to bring cutting-edge technologies to the Angular ecosystem. I also love hiking, and I'm on Twitter if you want to talk more about Analog after. So what is Analog? And there's three parts to it. It's Vite-powered, it's Angular, and it's a meta framework. I'm going to go into all three of these and sort of give you an introduction of what these things are. So let's start with the easy one, right? We all love Angular, that's why we're here, or at least we work with it. So that should be pretty quick. And up until a couple days ago, Angular, on its old documentation side, defined itself as an application design framework and development platform for creating efficient and sophisticated single-page apps, which is a hell of a sentence. But the way I understand it, it's just a batteries-included approach to building performant SPAs, right? It has a core, which takes care of updating your views. We have components, we have directives, we have a dependency injection framework where we can provide services. All of that is inside of the core. We have an opinionated data fetching solution with the HTTP client where we can fetch remote data from a server or something. We have not one but two form solutions. We have template-driven forms, and we also have reactive forms. So you can, at any complexity, you can build your forms. You don't have to grab a third-party library. We have the Angular router who takes care of sort of updating the view as the user interacts with your application. Again, that's built into the framework. You don't have to go to a third party for that. And, which might be surprising for a lot of you, but not as much anymore after Minko's talk, we have built-in server-side rendering support with Angular, which is an Express adapter that sort of tells Express how to render Angular applications on the server. And of course, that used to be front and center on the documentation page, right? Well, not as much. It's right down here in the bottom left. You really have to dig deep to find a guide on how to use server-side rendering with Angular, which makes sense because Angular defined itself as a way to build performant single-page applications, right? So server-side rendering was sort of like not a core focus up until now. But if you're on tech Twitter like I am, you can't help but feel left out if you look at all the new and hot stuff. You have Next.js with React server components. You have Quick, who proudly states its apps start on the server, and you have Nuxt, which is Vue's way of building production-grade full-stack web apps. Of course, full stack means there's a server involved, right? But times are changing, as we heard, and the Angular Renaissance is in full swing, and as of this week, Angular.dev is the new way of really getting all the newest documentation and learning how Angular works. And as part of the first things we learn about Angular on this new page is that it has built-in hydration, which as a full-stack developer makes me incredibly happy because it allows us to really build first-class full-stack Angular apps. And this is a big deal because up until version 16, Angular's hydration didn't support non-destructive hydration. So something like that where you get the HTML rendered from the server, and then Angular actually had to destroy that HTML and rebuild it in JavaScript, and you get this flickering, right? Which is just not a great user experience. So since version 16, we can actually have client-side hydration that is non-destructive, which actually enables us to build first-class Angular apps, and we get rid of that flicker. So technically now we have everything to build our startup idea, right, in a weekend, deploy it, and then take advantage of Angular's enterprise support as our company scales, right? So why is it that, again, I go on tech Twitter and see what all the cool people are building, and I keep seeing this, right? I see this deploy button. And the thing is, when you build a full stack application, you need more than just the front end, right? And Vercel has found a way to make that incredibly easy, and that's what I'm going to talk about next, pun intended, and that's meta frameworks. So what is a meta framework? And Ben Holmes from Astro is actually a meta framework too, has a great definition. A meta framework is a system one level above that stitches multiple frameworks together. And that's exactly what Next.js is. It's a great example of a meta framework, and it's built on React, right? And it makes perfect sense because if we look at what React is actually just concerned with a very specific part of an application. And we like to compare React and Angular, especially when you start out. Should I use Angular? Should I use React? They're actually not quite the same thing because React is only concerned about the interface. And if you go on the React website, they literally call themselves the library for web and native user interfaces. So it has a very more limited scope than Angular has, right? And it's sort of that Next.js took React and then built all these solutions around it. It's adding all these battery packs. It has data fetching, file-based routing, server rendering, server actions, and React server components. Technically, React server components are also a React feature, but you need a server, which is what Next provides. And only after that, React and Next.js start to look a lot like Angular, right? So you could make the argument that Angular is actually a meta framework in itself. But I would say not quite yet, right? And that's why we still see so many new projects that start out with Next.js. Because to be a next level meta framework, Angular's server-side rendering story, Angular's server story is not quite there yet, right? Which makes perfect sense because it hasn't been a focus, really. What we're missing is a Next.js level server integration, right? And it doesn't have that yet. Which specifically I'm talking about server-side rendering, static site generation, API routes, and server-side data fetching. If you have all of this, I would say you have a next level server story. And that's where Analog comes into play, right? Because Analog is built to bring that next level server integration to Angular. And it does so by bringing along a good friend, which is Nitro. You might have heard of Nitro, you might have never heard of Nitro, but it is a next generation server toolkit that is very hackable. What does that mean, right? It's pretty much a server, like a way to build servers with meta frameworks in mind. It's actually used for Nuxt, which is Vue's meta framework, and it's sort of like built for meta frameworks. So it means it's incredibly hackable and configurable, and that's what Analog takes advantage of and sort of like puts Angular on top of Nitro. And it does so by providing a custom renderer for server-side rendering. So if your request hits the Nitro backend server and it doesn't match any API route, you can define a custom renderer to sort of return that page to you. And Analog provides that renderer and tells Nitro how to render these Angular pages, right? And then it has Nitro has something called route rules, which is an incredibly powerful way to customize caching at a route level. And Analog exposes that functionality to you. So in the Analog configuration, you can define route rules, and on a route level, you can say, oh, my marketing site, my homepage never changes, right? I want to just pre-render that at build time, so it's served incredibly fast, search engine optimization, all of that, great performance for my marketing side, and then once I go into the app, I make it more dynamic, right? And I can do that on a route level. So that in itself is incredibly powerful. And then even goes further because you can cache different routes at a different level. It also supports stuff like stale while revalidate. All of that is given to you and exposed to you through Analog. So again, with Analog and Nitro, you get access to next level server-side rendering and static site generation with Angular. But Nitro doesn't only render your Angular pages. I talked about API routes a little bit before. And there's a really easy way to create your own API in the same application as your Angular app with Analog, right? Because all you need is, in your source folder, you create a server folder, create a routes folder, and everything in there you can build out your API simply by your folder structure and then naming your files. That's all you need, and you're good to go. And I can actually show you that. I have an Analog app here, and inside of these routes folder, I have a V1, and then I have a talks route, and in this talks route, I'm returning all the great talks of this conference simply from an array right now, but you can also, this is on the server, so you can use stuff to fetch that data from a database as this conference grows, right? This is the server, so you can do everything you can do in a server right here. And if I now go to the browser, and I go to the API V1 talks, I get a JSON response with all the talks that I just defined in that same folder that I create my Angular application in. So yeah, what Nitro does under the hood, it translates that folder structure into that endpoint. And then, like I said, I added a route event handler with all the code, and it's sort of like that's what's executed whenever I request that endpoint. So we have file-based routing with Nitro. So of course, we want file-based routing with our Angular application, with the front end too, right? And that's thanks to Marco's incredible work, is possible right now. So you can use that same convention to create your API routes, to create the routes on your front end. So I have a pages folder. Everything in the pages is going to be turned into an actual page component and going to be available through the front end routing. And I have a pathless talks component, and I have a talks.page.ts file right here. So that's going to turn into a talks route. There's no manual wiring up you do. There's no route files you have to manage. Simply by following that same convention that you use on the server on the front end, Analog takes all of that and puts your components and routes in the right place. There's also something weird you might have noticed. Like, why is there a talks.server.ts file in my pages component? And that's another really cool thing that you get out of the box with Analog is server-side data fetching, which means that before we even render the site, we can fetch data on the server that we then expose to our Angular component through a simple input. So I'm going to show you really quick what that is. So in my app folder, I have this pages directory, and I have the talks, and I have a talks component. And currently, I'm actually using the HTTP client to get that talks data from the endpoint I created earlier, the API endpoint. So right now, I'm just fetching it like I would in like a regular Angular application. And I can show you guys if I go to talks. I'm fetching all the talks, and you can see over here in the network tab, it goes out and it fetches that data from the client. But if I have bad connection, so if I throttle this and I refresh, you see that it's actually happening. The data fetching is happening currently on the client side. So even though part of the page is available, the dynamic data from the talks, I still have to wait. until that is returned. And only then I can interact with these components. So with server-side data fetching, I can create a talks.server.ts. Again, I'm returning the same files, talks here. Again, I'm on the server, so I could also query this from the database, and I'm returning this before the page even loads. So if I go to my talks component and I use that load function from Analog, now those talks are available to me before I even render the page on the server, right? So what's if I go back here now and I refresh the page, I don't see a request anymore because that happened on the server before I rendered. And if I throttle it and I refresh, again, there's no request. And you see the loading indicator up here, but once it returns, all the data is immediately available. There's no second thing going on. It's all happening on the server. Sweet. So again, I have a load function in that server.ts file, and that function exposes data that I can use to render Angular on the server. Best part is, though, that you get all of this and then you get more, because Nitro supports zero config deploys to all big cloud providers. Nitro knows how to run on Cloudflare, Firebase, Netlify, and of course, Vercel. So you really get that experience of the one-click deploy, and you get that Next.js level developer experience and server integration. So Analog really turns Angular into this powerful full-stack meta framework. So there's one more thing we're talking about, and that is it's Vite powered, right? And what is Vite? Vite lets us tie together Nitro and Angular, and lets us use the file system to define Angular routes. So what is Vite? Well, it's French, and it means quick. Doesn't help much, right? It's a build tool, but it's much more than that, and it has two parts. It's a dev server and also a build command. And dev server is so good, it powers ngserve. And you're wondering, how is it so good, right? And it does something pretty smart. Instead of bundling everything up front, like Webpack did, where even for the dev server, you sort of had to traverse all your source code and then bundle it up front, and once it built the bundle, your dev server became available. Vite does something very smart. It doesn't do as much work, and it just lets the browser do that work for you. So what do I mean by that? Well, it gives you a server that's immediately available, and then as you, in your browser, request the route that you're working on, it then goes out and fetches all the modules and transpiles all the modules only for the current route, which means that it doesn't really matter how big your application grows, because only what's needed for that current stuff you're working on is getting fetched right now and turned into ECMAScript modules, and then the browser sort of takes over from there. But it's even smarter than that, because it sort of distinguishes between your source code and then also your dependencies. Your source code is going to change a lot, right? You want that to be updated as you develop. But your dependencies often don't change that much. So in order to speed up the process and not have to fetch hundreds of modules from your dependencies, actually, as you start the development servers, Vite pre-bundles these dependencies with ESBuild, which we heard is a very fast Go-based bundler that turns source code into JavaScript. So you have the pre-bundling for dependencies, which sort of allows, takes some work off the browser, and then for your source code, the browser is doing most of the lifting. So it stays quick, right? Even as your applications grow. And that's, I think, is one of the main reasons why the Angular team also went with Vite for that dev server, for their new dev server. But then there's also a build command, and it's build command bundles your application to the artifacts that you then deliver to your clients. And Vite's build command is built on top of rollup, and it's optimized by default, so you get pretty good performance and bundle size by default, and it's highly customizable. And that's actually what makes it so interesting for people to develop on, because it has plugins, right? Rollup's big strength is its plugin interface, and you can literally customize everything about your build with plugins. And Vite does something very smart, because it sort of took Rollup's plugin interface and also made their dev server compatible with it. So you can build on plugins on top of Rollup that alter your development experience and also your build experience. And that's pretty much what Analog takes advantage of too. And you get access to a massive ecosystem, right? There's Rollup plugins for pretty much everything. I didn't even know Rollup existed before I started contributing to Analog, but it's a massive ecosystem, and there's stuff like during your build, you can send a notification to something. Well, there's a Rollup plugin for this, so literally anything you can imagine. And that's what makes Analog, that's what makes Analog, right? It turns Angular into a Vite plugin. Analog tells Vite how to use Angular for development, and then also build Angular applications with Rollup. But there's one big problem with Rollup, and Rollup, for now, is JavaScript. So it's not so quick, because it's still limited by JavaScript being single-threaded and not native. Which means that, yeah, it's not as quick as ESBuild, which makes sense now that we know that the Angular team, with the scale of Google applications, announced both Vite and ESBuild support, because the ngserve command is powered by Vite, keeps the development experience super quick, and then the ngbuild command uses the ESBuilder, which uses Go, which compiles to native code, which is super fast, parallelizes a lot of work, which means that even at Google scale applications you get, even at Google scale applications you get really, really fast builds. So ultimately, Vite is just an implementation detail of the Angular CLI, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because the Angular team doesn't want you to care about what the CLI uses as a dev server or build tool. They only want you to care about ngserve, ngbuild, and ngupdate, right? So if they ever decide to move away from Vite and ESBuild, all you're going to need is ngupdate, and they can sort of like switch out what powers it under the hood. But you lose the customizability, which is probably fine for 99% of enterprise applications. But there is a Vite wide world out there, right? And that's what Analog gives you access to. And that's especially Analog's Angular Vite plugin, because it turns Angular into a Vite plugin, which means you get access to stuff like Vitest, right? And it happens that the React Query team uses Vitest for their React Query tests. Now the Angular Query adapter just uses those Vitests too. You have component playwright component testing that runs on Vite. You have Astro, which runs on Vite. We can now use Angular components with. And then you have, of course, Nitro, which Analog hooks up with Angular, and you get that Next.js level app building experience to deploy with a single click. So there's one more thing. I'm running out of time a little bit, but maybe we can squeeze this in. Because there's something really cool that happens if you have full control over your dev and build process. You can do something like analog files, right? Which, if you have community members like Brandon and Chow who create new file formats on the weekend for fun, you can do that with Vite, right? And you end up with something like this that's actually perfectly working Angular in an Angular application, right? Which is what the authoring format could be looking like in the future. A lot less boilerplate and a lot more focused on what you actually want to do in your component. So this is actually working in this application that I showed you guys. And it works with Vite because with Vite, we can actually tell with Vite, we can actually translate this into a perfectly valid Angular component. So we have a script tag here, we have our template tag here, we have a style tag here, we have an actual .analog component, and if I now run the test, we get a snapshot of what it looks like under the hood, and it's just a regular Angular component, right? And I actually did this before the talk, and I copied the code over, so we were actually running an analog component over here. So I can actually change this back and show you guys that this works. If I turn this into an analog component, if I upload the import here, and then if I copy the code over from the original analog component, we'll see that this actually still works if I now restart the dev server. Oh. I still have working analog components or Angular components over here, which are now coming from a .analog file. So we have a two-step process of translating the analog file format into Angular components, and then the Vite plugin tells, or the analog Vite plugin tells Vite how to render these Angular components. So it's really cool. And there's one last thing I want to show you guys, and that is that this page, this talks page that I've been showing you guys, is actually written in Markdown, because we do actually something really cool with analog components. We support Markdown directly in your template tag. So we actually do something where we transform your Markdown into HTML for your Angular template, and then we turn the Angular template into something the browser understands, all with Vite. So you can do stuff like this with Vite. It's possible today. It works. You can try it out, and the most important thing is go build your ideas in the weekend, give Analog a try, and have fun with it. And thanks for listening to me.